Thidwick, the Big-Hearted Moose by Dr. Seuss. Up at Lake Winnebago, the far northern shore, lives a huge herd of moose, about 60 or more. And they all go around in a big happy bunch, looking for nice tender moose moss to munch. Up at Lake Winnebago, one day, they were lunching, just strolling along, enjoying their munching. For the moose moss that day was especially fine, when it happened that Thidwick, the last moose in line, saw a bingle bug sitting. The bug called out, "Hey! This is such a long road, and it's such a hot day. Would you mind if I rode on your horns for a way?"
"Of course not," smiled Thidwick, the big-hearted moose. "I'm happy. My antlers can be of some use. There's room there to spare, and I'm happy to share. Be my guest, and I hope that you're comfortable there."
So the bingle bug picked up out a nice easy seat, and the moose went on looking for moose moss to eat. Well, an hour or so later, the bug heard a squeak, and he heard the small voice of a tree spider speak.
"I say,"
said the spider,
"you've got a fine place. That moose seems quite friendly, has such a nice face. If I got on too, do you think you would mind?"
"Hop aboard," laughed the bug. "And I think that you'll find that the moose won't object. He's a big-hearted kind."
"I accept," said the spider, "with joy and delight."
And he started a web on the horn on the right. While the spider was spinning, he heard a gay song, and a fresh little zinazoo bird came along. He hopped and he stared and he chirped, "Well, well, well! What a smart place to build! What a great place to dwell! I've been living on trees ever since I was born. But here's something new. Why not live on a horn? If there's room for two, then there's room for three.
There's plenty of room.
And it's free!" Thidwick stopped walking. What was all of that talking? These guests had caught Thidwick, the moose, unaware.
"Hey!" he yelled out. "What's going on up there?"
"Just building a nest," said the zinazoo. The zinazoo said, and began yanking hairs out of poor Thidwick's head. And he plucked out exactly 204. "Don't worry," he laughed. "You'll always grow more." Then he dozed off to sleep in his fine moose hair nest.
"This bird," murmured Thidwick, "is sort of a pest. But I'm a good sport, so I'll let him rest, for a host above all must be nice to his guest. Besides now, it's quite late in the day, and surely tomorrow they'll all go away."
But alas, the next morning the sunlight brought to Thidwick's sad eyes a most unwelcoming sight. "Meet my wife," said the bird. "I was married last night. And perhaps by the way I should mention to you that her uncle is coming to live with us too. You're a very fine host. I know you'd be willing." Then the uncle, a woodpecker, started drilling. And Thidwick's friend shouted, "Get rid of those pests!"
"I would, but I can't," sobbed poor Thidwick. "They're guests."
"Yes, indeed," his friends answered, and all of them frowned. "If those are your guests, we don't want you around. You can't stay with us because it's just not our sort." and they all turned their backs and walked off with a snort. Now the big friendless moose walked alone and forlorn, with 4 great big woodpecker holes in his horn. "What holes?" whispered Herman, a squirrel who spied on him. "What holes to hide nuts in? Mind if I hide 'em?" "They're yours," called the woodpecker. "Get right inside 'em. This big-hearted moose runs a public hotel. Bring your nuts, bring your wife, bring your children as well." So the whole squirrel family jumped on pell-mell. And the very next thing the poor animal knew, a bobcat and turtle were living there too. Now what was the big-hearted moose going to do? Well, what would you do if it happened to you? You couldn't say scat, 'cause that wouldn't be right. You couldn't shout scram, 'cause that isn't polite. A host has to put up with all kinds of pests, for a host above all must be nice to his guests. So you'd try hard to smile, and you'd try hard to look sweet, and you'd go right on looking for moose moss to eat. But now it was winter, and that wasn't easy, for moose moss gets scarce when the weather gets freezy. The food was soon gone, and the cold northern shore of Lake Winnebago there was no more. And all Thidwick's friends swam away in a bunch to the south of the lake where there's moose moss to munch. He watched the herd living, and then Thidwick knew he'd starve if he stayed there. He'd have to go too. He stepped in the water, then, "Oh, what a fuss! Stop!" screamed his guests. "You can't do this to us! These horns are our home, and you've no right to take our home to the far distant side of the lake." "Be fair," Thidwick begged, with a lump in his throat. "We are fair," said the bug. "We'll decide this by a vote, and all those in favor say aye, and all those in favor of staying say no, nay." "Aye," shouted Thidwick, and then he was done. "Nay," they all yelled. He lost 11-1. "We win!" screamed the guests, by a very large score, and poor starving Thidwick climbed back onto the shore. Then do you know what those pests did? They asked in some more. They asked in a fox who jumped in from the trees. They asked in some mice, and they asked in some fleas. They asked a big bear, and then, if you please, came a swarm of 362 bees. Poor Thidwick sank down with a groan to his knees. And then came something that made his heart freeze. Bullets came zinging right past Thidwick's face. Guns were banging all over the place. "Get that moose! Get that moose!" Thidwick heard voices call. "Fire again, and shoot straight, one and all! We must get his head for the Harvard Club wall." Thidwick took his heels with a load on his head. With 500 pounds on his horns, the moose fled. He could have run faster without those pests, but hosts above all must be nice to their guests. Up canyon, off cliff, over wild rocky trail, with bullets bing bang bouncing around him like hail. Up gully, through gulch, and down slippery sluice, with his hard-hearted guests raced the soft-hearted moose. Then finally they had him because of those pests. He had run out of luck. Because of those guests, his horns, they were stuck. He gasped, he felt faint, and the whole world grew fuzzy. Thidwick was finished completely, or was he? Finished? Not Thidwick. Definitely not. It's true. It was in a most terrible spot. But now he remembered a thing that he'd forgot. A wonderful something that happens each year to the horns of all the moose and the horns of all the deer. Today was the day that we happened to know. The old horns came off and the new ones would grow. And he called the pests on his horn as they threw him. You wanted my horns, and you're quite welcome to them. Keep them, they're yours. As for me, I shall take myself to the far distant side of the lake. And he swam Winnebago, and he found his old bunch, and arrived just in time for a wonderful lunch at the south of the lake, where there's moose moss to munch. His old horns today are where you knew they would be. His guests are all still on them, all stuffed as they should be.